On the 16th of May, EDSK published a new report called Evolution and Revolution, in which we set out a 10-year plan for reforming primary and secondary education in England. Our plan included, among other things, a baccalaureate for all 14 to 18-year-olds that would bring academic, applied and technical courses together under one roof, as well as everyone studying core English and core maths, otherwise known as literacy and numeracy, up to age 18. Bold as these proposals may sound, we do not pretend to be the first people to make such suggestions. In fact, 2 decades ago, in 2004, Mike Tomlinson, now Sir Mike Tomlinson, chaired a working group for the then Labour government, which ended up proposing a diploma for all 14 to 19-year-olds that contained many of the same ideas as EDSK's new report. Our guest today is Sir Mike himself, who is perfectly placed to tell us what the diplomas were, what benefits they were supposed to offer, and also why his proposals were never fully implemented in the months and years after the working group's final report was published. I'm Tom Richmond, the director of the EDSK think tank, and to hear more about the now infamous policy saga that was the 14 to 19 diplomas, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast from the education and skills think tank EDSK that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including schools, colleges, universities and apprenticeships. You can find out more about EDSK's research at edsk.org or on Twitter at EDSK Think Tank.
Mike, we will of course be talking about your landmark 2004 report in this podcast, but just before we do, I thought it was worth starting our conversation a year earlier in 2003 when the working group that you chaired was first established. So I'm interested in what problem, or perhaps problems, you and your working group were originally tasked with solving by then Education Secretary Charles Clarke.
I think I should also mention that a very considerable influence in this whole work was David Miliband, who at the time was his minister. And David had produced a paper some years before he got into politics, advocating a baccalaureate type structure. I was told by Charles and by David that he wanted the group to be radical in its thinking and in its proposals for change. The particular reasons were numerous in a way. First of all was the very fragmented qualifications scene that was then even more fragmented than it is today, leading to, in some cases, students making choices which were unwise or very often led them into a cul-de-sac of having no progression from that particular point. And also the fact that the qualifications available were not such that they were inclusive and could take account of all students and their achievements at whatever point in their education or training. There was also a focus on a structure which gave due attention to the development of life and work skills and understanding and knowledge, all of which were regarded as generally unrepresented in the curriculum at the time, even in technical qualifications. This was also associated with the government's then intention, which it did actually introduce, was to raise the leaving age for students of education or training to 18 years old, so that hence the focus became what was the appropriate curriculum and assessment systems for 14 to 18, rather than thinking of it 14 to 16 and then possibly staying on. So there are a whole range of matters that were set out for the group to think about. They were not considered as exhaustive. They were simply as indicators of what we were expected to look at. But it was clear to me and to the group that the focus had to be on the curriculum and assessment, and get the curriculum right first before moving to the question of how to assess it. We were encouraged throughout to be as radical as possible and to not consider any of the then barriers to be, if you like, impossible to overcome. And so that was the background to it. And then we created a group which represented the interests of all groups, whether from higher education, further education, maintained schools, independent schools, charitable bodies that were concerned with young people who, particularly young people who were either homeless or living on the streets, or in particular had absolutely no educational achievements to their name.
So the backdrop is you've got some political will behind this. You have the Education Secretary and the Schools Minister. They've got a system that they look at and they think needs to be addressed. So that was the origin of the working group's final report in 2004, which famously included the proposal for 14 to 19 diplomas. So how would you describe the diplomas to a parent or to a politician who hadn't come across them before? What was it that made these diplomas different from what was then available in secondary schools in England?
I think in its simplest sense, we wanted a structure which could and should contain some specified elements, such as, for example, the courses that they'd studied, the experiences they'd had, the skills that they'd developed, and there would be various levels of performance so that it could be inclusive. The difference between what was then happening and this proposal was that we regarded education as more than just the qualifications that young people achieve, and that though those were important and not being undermined at all, there were a whole range of other experiences that young people had which were not given any credit whatsoever. If you say which, well, I mean, the obvious one for many young people was Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme. There was also, for us, the fact that a lot of young people were carers, and therefore you could give them credit for that activity. There are also a lot of extracurricular activities which could be easily encompassed within the framework. The individual courses that students followed would still be graded separately, but the many other components didn't lend themselves to being assessed, and in fact would probably be destroyed if they were assessed. So that those would be in effect an electronic record of their activities beyond their studies. We were clear that to get the full diploma awarded at whatever level, all the elements had to be successfully passed in some form or another. And given that the move was to 14 to 18 as a compulsory phase, then the issue of GCSE and terminal assessment at 16 was something we had to consider. But we did have a core, and that was maths and English. It was also requiring students to do what we called an extended project, a chance to do a piece of work which would develop some of the skills which they would need in employment, but particularly in HE, i.e. they'd take a topic, they'd research it themselves, they'd write it up. It did in fact become, and remains, a separate qualification in its own right, the extended project qualification. And that would be part of the core, along with experiences. And in order to get a clear steer from the CBI as to what it was that employers wanted, they were able to condense it into a small number, I think 6 particular attributes that they were looking for in young people, but were not available to them in simple terms from qualifications alone. I mean, the most striking thing was they were exceedingly suspicious of GCSE English and mathematics as being proxies for numeracy and literacy. And they remain critical to this day. And therefore we advocated that mathematics and English should be seen more as numeracy and literacy. And in that sense, we also expected that mathematics would be continued up to 18, aligned with their subject study. We didn't find a single A-level or other course which would not be able to accept a unit of mathematics that was relevant to that subject study. And it was very interesting that of the first ones, the engineering one was very much supported by the engineering bodies. It was Cambridge University that created the mathematics unit, which would support engineering. So it didn't matter what subject, history, geography, you were into statistics, business studies speaks for itself in a way. But we were not wanting everybody to do A-level mathematics. I find the fact that we were talking about that interesting in respect of what the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has recently advocated in his advanced baccalaureate structure. So I would argue with parents that what we were doing was providing a qualification, the diploma, which didn't just take account of a student's qualifications, but more importantly, equally importantly, took account of all the other experiences they had had or things outside of school itself. I mean, we tend to forget that many young people, for example, certainly from the age of 16, have part-time jobs. And yet we make no mention of it, up to now anyway. We make no mention of the skills that embodies in many, many young people.
So you've got what you described as a framework, a diploma framework, into which you have these different elements, such as the core learning around maths and literacy. You have the subjects alongside that, the main learning, as you called it, and you had the diploma available at 4 different levels. So this clearly would have represented a change from where we were. So what was the reaction to the diplomas from, say, teachers and the major unions at the time?
Well, the reaction of all parties, not least the teachers and unions, were positive. The teacher bodies had been kept informed throughout and were very supportive. Equally, the FE sector was, the HE sector was, which was quite a struggle to get the HE sector to believe that this was the right way forward. But they did in the end, thanks to the representative from HE that was on our working group. And we also had support from employers, not least the Education Committee of the CBI. So even at the interim report stage and at the final stage, it was the first piece of educational thinking that actually had the support of almost every group across the piece. The other thing I think is worth mentioning is that Charles Clarke agreed that I could share the interim and final reports with all the political opposition leaders in advance of its publication. And that was the first time that had been done.
Well, I noticed that Charles Clarke himself was very positive about your proposals. He described the diploma as a, quote, cogently argued, challenging and compelling vision of the future. And he also said in Parliament that diplomas, quote, would establish a single, coherent, understood qualifications framework for the first time. It would put vocational and academic qualifications on a common footing, again for the first time, and would promote greater personalisation of the curriculum to meet the needs of individuals and so greater choice for young people. So that was the good news. But then Prime Minister Tony Blair took a different view. So talk us through what happened here. How did we end up in a situation where the Education Secretary was very positive, but the Prime Minister of the day wasn't?
It's a long story, and I'll give it as briefly as I can. I've already indicated that we were given permission to share the reports before they were actually published with not just ministers of the day, but also leaders of the opposition parties in Parliament, that at the time were mainly 2. That was the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. So they had the reports before they were published. One of those opposition leaders decided just prior to publication to Parliament that he made a speech that said, whatever the proposals were, he would defend A-levels and they were not to be got rid of. The fact that the report never mentioned getting rid of A-levels is, of course, well, old history now. On the day of the publication of the report, I and many others, including Charles Clarke and David Miliband, were at a reception where both of them stood up and said, this is going to be the biggest change in education, but the most important change. At the same time, the Prime Minister was making a speech, not necessarily about education, But given what the opposition leader had said, and remember we're near to an election as well, given what the opposition leader had said about maintaining A-levels, the Prime Minister unfortunately decided to weigh in and say he would protect A-levels. And again, the fact that the proposals themselves didn't in any way, shape or form suggest that A-levels would be got rid of. And that was the heart of the issue. I think it's also fair to say subsequently that the presentation by a member of the policy unit in the number 10 and the permanent secretary at the DFE both subsequently apologised to me because they didn't feel they'd presented the proposals in a particularly good way and considered that one of the major mistakes. So it was a very complicated picture.
Indeed, it certainly sounds like it. So we have a potential gap opening up between what the Education Secretary and the Education Department wants to do and what the Prime Minister wants to do. As you mentioned, we're running up to the 2005 general election here. And then in December 2004, Charles Clarke was replaced as Education Secretary by Ruth Kelly. Did that change of personnel have any impact in your view, bearing in mind that by that point your report had already been published earlier?
Well, in so far as Ruth Kelly was concerned, she made it clear to me at a meeting that there would not be the wholesale introduction of the changes proposed. But she was prepared to see a diploma for the technical subjects to be considered. And of course, Ed Balls came in and really spearheaded that piece of work. But of course, it was in a sense going back to where we were rather than going forward, in that we were looking at what we might do to make technical education more attractive, but not necessarily to be bothered about changing anything on the academic side.
Yes, indeed. So if we roll forward a little bit to February 2005, the government published a white paper on 14 to 19 education, in which Ruth Kelly did declare that, and I quote, "For the first time, we are going to take on and tackle the intellectual snobbery which has relegated vocational education to a second-class, second-best education." However, in my personal view, what they actually published looked like a retreat from your original vision for diplomas, because yes, the white paper confirmed the introduction of the diplomas, as you were saying, which covered vocational courses in industry sectors. It would be available, the diplomas, at different levels, which again was, spoke to your report too. But crucially, the white paper stated in no uncertain terms that the government would, quote, retain GCSEs and A-levels as cornerstones of the new system. And I found a comment from you at the time, which was that in response to this white paper, you said that it may only emphasize the difference between the vocational and the academic rather than bringing them together. And you added that my greatest fear is that vocational will continue to be seen as second best and available and taken by those who can't do anything better. Is that still your view now, looking back on this?
That is still my view. It's only modified by the experience I've had with the university technical colleges, which prove once and for all that one can have very high quality technical education, and that it is an offer, not ignoring the academic bits either. It's an offer which many young people who would have been written off by the education system previously are achieving highly and getting into very high level apprenticeships and university. So, if nothing else, my view has been reinforced by what's happened since, and I do not see in T levels anything which changes that view.
Well, indeed, here we are 20 years later. T levels have appeared. BTECs may be on the way out. We have a general election just months away. You've had plenty of time, of course, to reflect on what I'm sure was quite a frustrating experience in many respects. So looking back now, do you think you could have done anything differently to give your diplomas a better chance of survival, either in terms of what the diploma actually was and how it was designed, or also, as you mentioned, thinking about the way it was just presented to politicians and policymakers at the time?
I don't think in terms of the design, in its broadest sense, I would want to change. I probably would now, for example, want to include in the core digital, because I do think, that has now become so central to everyone's life that not to be proficient in that and understanding of it would be wrong. The other thing that we didn't make enough of, but we did mention, was in the numeracy, we wanted to include content which was relevant to financial education. I found it very worrying that many young people, 16 to 18, even ignoring the 14 to 16 for a moment, had no concept of, for example, mortgages, no idea of what a credit card rate of interest was, and so on. So I think there was I think there's more to be done there now than we made a point of at the time. I think in terms of presentation, the problem I have is that and I've seen it with T-levels as well, the diplomas ended up in the hands of officials in the department. And they successfully made it so damn complicated that actually, in the end, it wore people down. And therefore, I would not give any implementation to the department. I would much prefer it to be done by a separate group that brought together people who really knew what they were talking about and who were genuinely supportive of what was being proposed. So I would hope also that I didn't at the time, get to be able to present my proposals to the ultimate decision makers, i.e. the Prime Minister and others in the department.
So if we leave the politics just to one side, there was clearly a lot happening in a very short space of time around the publication of your report. But given all the work that you and your working group did on the actual strengths and weaknesses of secondary education itself back in 2004, I'm curious as to how much of that actual analysis that underpinned the report you still think holds true today when you look at the way that schools and colleges operate. You've mentioned that perhaps you might want to bring in something like digital skills, but actually in terms of the problems that you think we now need to solve, do you see a lot of similarity in terms of what you were trying to solve in 2004?
Yes, I do. I think the problems that we were trying to solve in 2004 remain in place. As I said, there are certain things that have happened, like the digital, as one example, that have clearly become much more centre stage than they were at the time of the report. But I think that we still have a system which in itself separates the academic from the technical. We still have a system which places, I think, undue attention to academic qualifications and achievements. And I find it disheartening that in this country, and it's probably this country alone in many senses, which seems to thrive on the idea that success can only be assured if there is also failure associated with it for others. And I reflect that in one Asian country, they'd given themselves the aspiration in education that every young person at school leaving age would achieve what we regard as 5 GCSEs, including English and maths. They ultimately achieved it within a shorter timescale than they'd set for themselves. And the media and all parties concerned absolutely lauded the education system for having done that. Can you imagine what would happen in this country if 100% of children got 5 A to C's in GCSE, well, now 9 to 4s, and including English and maths? Can you just speculate on what the headlines would be in certain newspapers? It would be simple. Standards have fallen. We seem to be obsessed with the idea that if you can get, and the diplomas wouldn't be all at level 3, they'd be at level 2 and level 1 and so on and so on. But the idea that everybody might have some recognition of their achievements, formal recognition of their achievement, was an anathema to some people. It became, in the words of one newspaper columnist, prizes for all. What makes us think that there are young people in this country who are not capable of achieving highly? I simply won't accept that. And given my background, if it hadn't been for education and the belief that some teachers had in me, I would never have had the career I've had. And to my dying day, all I want is for every young person to have those same opportunities. Whether or not they take advantage of them is not my decision, but I don't want them debarred from having those opportunities. And at the moment, we do that to too many young people in this country.
Some very powerful sentiments in there for sure. Okay, we are almost at the end of our discussion today, so it's time for one last question from me. The Labour Party have announced that they will be carrying out a curriculum and assessment review that covers primary and secondary education should they win the next election. So let's imagine a scenario in which a new Labour government comes to power and they then tell you, either privately or publicly, that they are keen to revisit this concept of a 14 to 19 system in England. What would your advice be to those ministers about how to reform this part of the education system?
I should say that question has been asked of me, what I would do. I think my answer is that there is a report available from a certain body that embodies most of what I would want, and therefore I advise them that, yes, to look at what I've said, yes, to talk to me, but actually there is a blueprint and it's yours.
You're far too kind. You're far too kind.
No, and I hasten to add that Kenneth Baker, Lord Baker, rang me last night to say that he fully supported the paper and all its content and wanted to get my reaction.
Well, I mean, I would urge all government ministers to do everything that EDSK recommends, of course, but I can't help but feel I'm not the most objective person in this conversation. So beyond reading, of course, your original report, which clearly we read as part of our research, and all the ideas that EDSK has been publishing, are there any other words of wisdom you'd offer ministers about maybe how to go about it rather than just what to do?
I think the first thing I would say is, given the nature of our education system, which is almost, and I use this with the small c, very conservative in its thinking and approach, and quite rightly so, in that they are genuinely concerned that any development should not disadvantage any of their existing students. I therefore see it as more evolution than revolution. I did at the time, and I still would. And I would say that what one can get, it is possible quite quickly to get that framework of the Baccalaureate, Diploma, whatever you want to call it, in place and begin to do the rest. I mean, for example, I would much prefer schools to be judged in terms of English and mathematics by what are currently functional skills. And to me, any school which is not getting, if not all, 99% of their students through those, as being a school which needs to become, which needs to ask itself, why not? And so I think there are things which we could do, not just in terms of the subject, but about those other bodies who are out externally are judging schools and colleges and what they do. If you don't do that, then of course you'll get inspection and the like out of step with the developments within the system and within individual schools. But I think that it would, I would say, I think within 5 years, certainly within the space of a parliament, you could have got this almost in place. And if you hadn't, you should be strongly criticised for being ineffective and inefficient.
Well, I don't think it'll be me criticising ministers on basis, but I'm sure that conversation will be had if after 5 years there wasn't too much progress. What a fascinating set of suggestions. Mike, thank you so much for joining us to talk about the incredible journey of the 14 to 19 diplomas. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you very much, Tom. All the best.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. You can download EDSK's new report, of course, called Evolution and Revolution from our website, edsk.org. If you enjoyed my conversation with Sir Mike, then please do share this episode with others and give us a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join us when we next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.